Hi, I'm Richard Christian Nelson, and this is my studio here in Tryon, North Carolina, in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And one of the great things about this studio is that is due north. I look out all day on Tryon Peak as I'm painting. When I teach, I like to break painting down into its individual components and develop a vocabulary for each of those things, and then work through the process. So what does that mean? Well, the first component is inspiration. What is it that motivated us to become artists in the first place? The next step is composition. We have to get something on our canvas. After that, drawing. We need to get that drawn onto our canvas properly. The next step is value. We really have to understand the lights and darks and how that works in our image. After that, color, which is a whole world. But what is warm and cool and rich color and more muted color? And then we get into the real sophisticated things about paint. Edges. Where is the paint thick? Where is the paint thinner? And finally, we call it done. That's the process of painting, and we'll go through that in this video as I set up a still life and paint it. One of my favorite artists is John Singer Sargent. And the thing I love about Sargent is the way that he mastered all of these aspects of painting. His inspiration, his composition, his drawing, values, color, it's all impeccable. So one thing that I've noticed about Sargent is in terms of value, even when we see these black and white plates of his color paintings, they are really terrific, and you just know that those paintings look terrific because as we move on to color, we see that he really captures the exact colors of the shadow side and the light side and the highlight and the background, even in that little oil sketch. And this is carried throughout his work, whether it's charcoal drawing or watercolor painting or his Grand Manner oils. They're just terrific. He was a master of the watercolor as well. And he was just inspired to paint what appealed to him for the most part once he got done with his society portraits and things. And the biggest thing about Sargent, in my opinion, is that he captures this visual truth. What does that subject feel like in its environment? You can feel the light, you can almost see the air around the subject. And he doesn't waste a lot of time with extraneous details. He goes right to the solidity of the form, and we sense what's important about this picture. This is called picture making. Very often, that's a term that's kind of not been used so much of late, but that's what they were doing. They were making pictures, and that really appeals to me. Another artist that I really like is Richard Schmidt, a living artist, and his book, Alla Prima, I highly recommend. He covers many of the things we'll be talking about, and really all the things that we'll be talking about, I'm not coming up with anything brand new. It's just the way that I've interpreted these things over the last 25 years, and hopefully some of this will appeal to you and help you to develop a process for painting to get where you want to be as an artist. Well, let's talk about paint and palettes. I like to use a large palette. I got this idea a long time ago that you could use a tracing paper pad because the tracing paper is impervious to the oil and the turpentine. You take the back of it and cut a hole for your thumb, and then you take the paper off and spray it with this spray mount adhesive until it's tacky. And then you can tear off a sheet of the tracing paper and put it on there, and you have a nice big palette and it's removable. You can scrape the paint that's left over onto your new palette whenever you feel like it. And with 50 sheets, that's 50 palettes in a pad of tracing paper. Well, a few years ago, a friend of mine made me a nice box that I can put in the freezer or refrigerator when I'm not painting, and that slows down the paint drying. Has this nice little top that you can unbuckle, and out comes a 14 by 17 board, which I have painted white, and it's got the spray mount adhesive on it, so it's tacky. So you just set it down somewhere and pull off a piece of tracing paper and lay it in position and just smooth it out. It just sticks on there. And I'll cut the hole out with a palette knife. And voila, I have a wonderful palette. And I think the key with your palette is you want to always put your color out in the same order. And I like to put out a good amount of paint so that as I'm painting, I'm not having to continually add new paint. And then I can put that in the freezer, as I say, and I don't have to feel like I'm wasting it. Well, the big thing about paint, the key color is white. And the kind of white you use is critical. I happen to use lead white, which is dangerous. If you get it on you or you ingest it somehow, our bodies have no way of expressing it. So it just builds up and it's not good, as we know. So if you're not a neat painter, I would stay away from the lead white. But lead white is the original white. It's very strong. And that's why they still use it on toys and things. But for the painter, it's good to know that you're using a strong material. And all this information is on these tubes. If you read here, it'll say what the pigment is, how light fast it is, whether it's transparent or opaque, if it's permanent. There are ratings for all these things. And with lead white, there's a health label as well. The other whites are titanium, which is much more opaque, a little bluer. And then there's zinc white, which is a more brittle kind of white over time, and it's less opaque. It's a nice mixing white. The Kremnitz, or lead white, dries very quickly if that's desirable to you, and the titanium takes a lot longer to dry. So I like to put out a good bit of white. White gets into all your mixtures pretty much, so it's going to affect all the rest of your painting. So if you have a fast drying white, then your painting is going to dry more quickly. And one thing I learned from the Group A book actually is to beat your whites a little bit. That means putting in a little bit of safflower or linseed oil, just a tiny bit. And then taking your palette knife and just mixing that oil into the white. And that gives you a nice buttery white. It's great when you start painting just to have that big mound of nice juicy white paint. The safflower oil is supposed to yellow less, and the linseed oil is a little more quick drying, I believe. It's known as a quick drying oil. And I find them kind of interchangeable. So this is the same palette that I use whether I'm indoors or outdoors, painting a figure, or landscape, still life. This is essentially my palette. It tends to shift over the time, but I like to have a warm and cool of each primary. So I start with Winsor Newton's Cadmium Lemon, which is a cool yellow. It's a kind of a light greenish yellow, and I don't use a lot of that particular color, but I like to have it there. There are certain things that you really need that for, like some kinds of lemons or certain kinds of foliage and such. I've also been using Blue Ridge oil colors, which is made up in Asheville, not too far from here. And that's a terrific paint. And this is their cadmium yellow medium. And you'll see as I put that out that it is warmer. It has a little more red in it. So now we come to our reds, and this is Winsor Newton Cadmium Red. I think it's a light, it's like a cadmium red light, but it's called cadmium red. All the manufacturers have variations in their titles and in their colors of their paint, so you just try different things over time until you find a palette that works for you. And as I say, it does shift. So this, I've switched from alizarin crimson recently to permanent rose or quinacridone. This is permanent rose, Winsor Newton. Eric also makes a nice permanent rose. So now I have my warm and cool red. So now we come to blue. This is Eric's Blue Ridge ultramarine blue, French ultramarine. And because that has red in it, people consider that their warm blue. And I've started using phthalo blue, which is a very potent color. You have to be careful of that stuff. But because that leans more towards the green end of the spectrum, that's my cooler blue. And there are some things that you just can't get without a phthalo or Prussian blue. Things like the color of a tropical lagoon or a swimming pool, or maybe certain colors in the sky down by the horizon. So that's why I've added phthalo to my palette. Then I come to the greens. I've added Viridian in the last few years. This is Winsor Newton Viridian. That's a cool green. And this is sap green. And I wouldn't be surprised if I stop using these colors eventually and just go with these warm and cool of the three primaries. But for now, I do have these tube greens. Then I just use a few earth tones still. Yellow ochre. And burnt sienna. I get a lot of my darks by mixing burnt sienna and ultramarine, or sap green and permanent rose or alizarin. Let's talk a little bit about easels. Earlier you saw my large studio easel that I work with most of the time when I'm here. But when I'm traveling, I always like to have my little portable easel. This is the Safari Creative Mark II. And as long as I have this baby in the car, I'm good for a class, or if I want to paint outdoors. You'll see that it's been customized a little bit, but all I have to do is set it up and pull out a few things, slide the drawer out, and we're good to go. Let's talk about some other materials. There's the trusty palette knife that you've seen me mix my paint with. I don't paint with the knife so much. I tend to paint with my brushes. And my favorite brushes are these extra long filberts. I find that I can get by with just about 4 or 5 of these extra long filberts. Lately I've been using these Robert Simmons Signet Eggberts, and they make 4 sizes, and if you get those 4 sizes in this extra large Richardson brush, I believe this is a number 20, then that's good for me to do a whole painting. And I do tend to customize things, so you'll notice I painted these ferrules black. That's so when I'm outdoors, I don't have the sun reflecting off of that silver. Sometimes that can get pretty bright. And then once in a while, maybe just for a highlight somewhere or to sign my paintings, I use a little Winsor Newton Series 7 number 4 brush. But that's not for painting. In general with painting, you always want to be using a bigger brush. And there's something I like about these extra long filberts. They get just enough paint and have just enough looseness and tightness that I like them a lot. A lot of folks who've taken workshops with me say that one thing that they really liked was getting turned on to these extra long filberts, or eggberts as they're sometimes called. There are a lot of different companies, so try different ones until you find the kind that you like the best. This is low odor mineral spirits. It's the only solvent that I use. So I put a little bit into my little jar here. Set it aside. I may need a little more later. It's good to have ventilation when you're working with any kind of solvent. Then I grab a little bit of linseed oil and I put it in the lid from that jar. Just a tiny bit. And you'll see later when I'll go for that, I'll let you know. I don't really use much oil as I'm painting till maybe towards the end, just to get the right consistency with some of those last strokes. Well, let's talk a little bit about canvas. I stretch and prime my own linen. This is Utrecht 66J linen, I prime it with 2 coats of rabbit skin glue, sanding between coats. And then I put a coat of Kremnitz white, the lead white, as a primer. And that gives me a relatively white surface. And you'll see when we set up our still life, I'm going to put it up here, and I'm going to decide whether I want it horizontal or vertical. One of the little modifications that I've made on this easel is I put little tiny nails in here and cut them off, and that way it really bites that canvas and holds it in there. When you're out in a windy environment, you'll be happy that your painting isn't going to go flying. Next, let's talk about paper towels. I use Viva paper towels, and these are terrific. If you buy those paper towels from the store, the cheap ones, they just feel like plastic or something, where these are very absorbent, very much like cloth. However, I don't like to wipe my canvas with paper towels because you will get little bits of paper towel into your painting. Okay, I think we're about ready to set up our still life. So even though my studio has great north light and I could just set up my subject and paint it with the window light, in different teaching applications I found that it's great to have this little cardboard box. You can get them at the grocery store. And you see I just cut a hole up in the upper front corner, and then you buy one of these lights from the hardware store, reflector lights they're called, and I put in a little compact fluorescent bulb. And you can get these bulbs in different color temperatures. This happens to be a daylight bulb, so it's going to be cooler, like the north light that's coming in my window. But you can see how that box isolates a lot of the light that's coming in out of the windows. And then when I put this light over here, I have a box to illuminate whatever my subject is. And you can move this light around. But you'll see as I make my setup, now I have something that I can study and work on as long as I need to. If you put something in there like a picture or something, it could be in there for weeks and you could paint on it. So that's a great solution, particularly if you don't have wonderful north light in your studio. One other little trick I've learned, especially when you're painting outdoors and facing the sun, is to cut a little piece of cardboard the size of your stretch canvas, if you are using stretch canvas. And then that'll make your painting opaque, so you won't have light coming through it. Well, as you can see, I've set up a still life here, and it's pretty simple, and it's utilizing the light from this box on a really nice piece of pottery. I've been painting a lot of North Carolina pottery. This is a Hilton vase, and then I put in some apples there to complement the blue of the vase with some red and green. That's an interesting combination to have those 2 colors, those complementary colors of red and green on an object, and to try to capture that, especially as it goes into light and shadow. And we'll be talking about all this as we forge ahead. But this is our setup, and the key thing about having your painting set up is you want to be really excited about it, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with this. I always say the subjects reveal themselves to us. So as you're working, sometimes you'll say, wow, I didn't even see that reflection in there, or that the light's peeking through right there. And that's all great. But what's really critical is that as you're working on it, you're excited about it, and you're not thinking, oh boy, I wish I had done something else, or put a different color in the background, or what have you. Sometimes you can come along and put something in and swap out an element, but the best is when you're just excited about what you've put up there, and you can't wait to start painting it. So before we start my actual painting, I like to take a little break to talk about 2 things. The first is value, and the second will be a little color demo. But there was a great teacher named Howard Pyle who taught folks like N.C. Wyeth and Maxfield Parrish in the early 20th century. And he said, if you don't understand value, you'll never be a representational painter. And what he means by that, you have to realize we're creating a 3-dimensional effect on a 2-dimensional surface. And the things that we have in our toolkit to do that are really light and shadow, color, advancing and receding, and other effects that we can get. But value is the foundation of all that. Let's start by just creating a circular shape with line on our canvas. So that's just a circle, it could be anything. But by adding another line to it, now it starts to feel as though perhaps it has some form. And then by adding another line, now our minds, which are always so active visually, are starting to see something that might be three-dimensional. So let's take that next step and just block in all of what's going to become the shadow. And if our light source is up here, coming from the upper left, we've now broken this object, whatever it is, this spherical object, into light and shadow. And that's the key. I always like to say it's like the Hatfields and the McCoys, or the Republicans and the Democrats. They just do not mix. If we're painting something and it's a red ball or a white baseball or something, that value in the light and the value in the shadow are never going to mix. Nothing in the shadow is going to be as light as anything in the light family. Nothing in the light family is going to be as dark as anything in the shadow family. That's why I like to get these two separated. And you'll see when I draw my painting on the canvas, when I do my drawing, that I'm going to indicate what is light and what is shadow. And that's a big foundation for getting started. So just to finish up on this, there are 5 aspects to this light and shadow. They are: the light family is composed of 2 things, the highlight and then what some call the halftone, or just the light. Then the shadow is actually more complex. In the shadow family, we have 3 members. We have the core shadow on the object itself, and then we have the cast shadow down on the surface that it's lying on. And often what that creates is what's called the reflected light in the shadow here. So we have core, cast, and reflected light. But again, none of that is going to be as light as anything in the light family, and vice versa. There might even be some background. But hopefully you understand that. And then what we're going to be working on, all the things we're going to talk about, get more and more sophisticated. So generally shadows tend to be crisper and darker as they're closer to the object, and softer and more fuzzy as they go away from that object. Because that shadow just represents an absence of light that the object's blocking out. And if there's a shadow on a surface, on an object, if it's a round object, that's going to be a soft shadow. And if it's a very sharp edge on a cube or something, then that's going to be, cut very sharp. And so all these things are in our toolkits to start to indicate value and form on our canvas. Let's move on to color. The thing for me is, I feel like we have to have a color wheel in our head. Hopefully you already do. If you don't, it's easy enough to get one. I compare it to knowing our left from our right, or knowing north, south, east, and west. But you always have to have a color wheel in your head as a painter, because if you're painting something that's yellow, say, and it's too yellow and you want to mute that, automatically go to a violet to gray it down. Or if you want to lean more towards a greenish yellow or towards a reddish yellow and get into the orange, your mind is always functioning that way. You can't look at a sunset without seeing all the different ranges of color and how they relate to each other. So I don't want to spend a bunch of time. I'm sure a lot of you have a color wheel in your head. But let's start. We'll just put our first primary up at the top. That's the way my color wheel works. I have yellow up at the top. And our next primary, red, I have over to the left of that. And then a nice blue. So these are our 3 primaries, and really we should be able to do anything with these colors. But we have many other colors that are availability. So let's go in and put in the secondary colors. And I'm just making thin mixtures here. This will be the canvas that I paint on for the actual demo. So orange is our mixture of red and yellow. And Violet is the mixture of blue and red. And when we mix yellow and blue, we get green. So, like everything we're going to talk about, that's all very simple. But like everything we're going to talk about, then the complexity begins. So we know that our strongest color contrast is when we have a complement. Yellow and violet, orange and blue, red and green. We also know that if we want to mute down a color, if we have a red, say, that's too intense, then we add a little bit of its complement, green. So this is also informative when we set up our still life. I have this blue vase and I wanted to get some other primary type colors in there, red and the greenish yellow. And it's more of an emotional thing. And sometimes you can have analogous color combinations where you put something yellow next to something green. Or you want a more contrasty color combination, like putting a yellow lemon next to a purple vase with the maximum contrast that you can get with color. So these are the kind of things we'll be talking about as we put color down. We know that the warmer colors advance and the cooler colors recede. And that's really all we need for our foundation of understanding color. And then we work with that vocabulary and with these tools and with these wonderful colors to capture what we see in our still life right in front of us. Okay, we're ready to get started. I just want to mention a couple things. In terms of canvas, I paint on this linen that I stretch and prime myself just because that's what I'm used to. And I've tried a lot of different things and I always seem to come back to this. But don't feel like you have to do that. Particularly when you're getting started, you don't want your materials to be so precious that you're nervous about wasting a canvas. So if you paint on panels or cotton duck canvas or whatever it is, that's fine. Try different things and find the thing that suits you the best. I also want to just have a word about ventilation. I've mentioned that. I have a fan over me that's usually on when I'm painting, pushing those paint fumes down. And then I usually have a window open or some kind of system to suck the air through. You want to be aware of letting these rags particularly accumulate a lot of odorless mineral spirits. So have a place outside to throw your rags and hopefully you'll keep your environment to where you're not going to be breathing a lot of fumes because that's not good for you. Another thing I wanted to mention is the shirt that I wear. A lot of folks think that if you wear a shirt or clothing that's darker, you won't reflect into your canvas. And I think that's true. I think if you're wearing, particularly outdoors and the sun's hitting you, and if you're wearing a yellow or a green shirt, very bright, it's going to kick up into your canvas and influence it. So that's the reason I'm wearing the black shirt here today, and often I wear dark clothes in my studio. Another thing I like to talk about is I really prefer standing up when I paint. It helps me to step back and step forward and just move my head around as I'm painting. I think that's very important. When I do sit down occasionally and paint, I think it's looking great, but then I get up and come back and I think, oh, it just, for some reason, it's almost mystical. It just feels more static. There's something that happens when your head is just in one position. And it's a little different when you're stepping back, stepping forward. In my studio, I have a mirror behind me, so I can step back. It's about 15 feet behind my easel usually, and I can step back and look in the mirror and see my painting in reverse, and that really helps a lot. A lot of painters carry a small hand mirror with them so that when they're out painting, they can step back a few feet and look at their painting in the hand mirror. And it's amazing how reversing that image in the mirror instantly can show different kinds of mistakes of drawing, mistakes of value. So that can be very helpful. Now, as I mentioned, I like to break painting up into these different components. And the first one is inspiration. What inspires us to paint? So I did set up this still life, and I'm very excited about painting these North Carolina pottery pieces that I've been doing. This is probably the 15th or 20th one that I've painted. I borrowed them from a friend of mine. They're all from the early 20th century. And I've just really enjoyed all the different forms and such, and they come from this area, and that means a lot to me. So that's important, and then finding the right colors and objects to put in there, that's something that inspires me. You may be inspired by anything, sewing machines or antique irons, or it could be anything, flowers. That's what's exciting about still life, anything that appeals to you. And then sometimes you can create a series, and that's exciting because you're just moving through these things and doing painting after painting. That's a big part of what we do, is getting into the process of painting. And the other thing I want to point out is it'd be very easy for me to put different fabrics and things back there. I could put them over that white board in there and arrange them different ways so the folds are getting different light and such. And sometimes I will be working on a painting and realize this just needs a piece of fabric draped across it and such. So if you'll look at some of my other still life work, often you'll see there are pieces of fabric in it and in the paintings. And I think that's, I just want you to know you can put anything in there, whatever inspires you. That's the key thing, is make sure that when you go to paint, you're just really excited to get into that painting. So that's what we're going to do now. I wanted to talk a little more about this viewfinder too. As I do my drawing, I can use this viewfinder. Now nobody out there or anywhere else can see what I see as I look through this with my one eye closed. But I'm going to get a little bit of thin burnt sienna on my brush here. I have my palette resting over here. And I'm going to get my composition back in my viewfinder. And now, so my head has to be where it's going to be when I paint, as I look through here. And now every man-made object, like that vase, has what's called an axis line that goes through it. So if I know the bottom of this vase is there and the top of it is about there, I can see on these marks on this viewfinder that the axis line is just a little past 1/3.